Patrick Laine, after not scoring for 15 games.
0.
Eisenman picks it up. Eisenman moving. Blue line chance. Tomas rattles in. He scores! What a goal! Beto! He saw Carey Price and then the bar. Are you kidding me?
You must be kidding me.
Did you just do that, Alexander Barkov?
What a stop by Lundqvist! What a goal! It doesn't get any better than this.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Hockey Podcast, back again with a great episode. This is officially starting season 4 for us.
Episode 1.
We're going to starting up season 4 by talking about Dynasty and Keeper Leagues. Originally, we were going to make this just about Dynasty Leagues, but we got a lot of questions about Keeper Leagues, and we figured that a lot of the talk we're going to do filters into Keeper Leagues. It just kind of works the same. So for this episode, we're going to talk about 3 main things in terms of running or being in a dynasty or keeper league. There's 3 important things, right? There's the drafting element of it, which has 3 different kind of dimensions if you look at it from all those 3. So we're looking at drafting, at maintaining / keeping players, and at trading players. And all of them have a little bit of a different element depending on where you're at. So there's contender, there's middle of the pack, and there's rebuilder. So we're going to look at everything from that lens. So what do you do if you're a contender? What do you do if you're a middle of the pack person versus what do you do if you're rebuilder? Because depending on where you at and how you approach the draft, even viewing it from that lens, it changes a lot about what you do in the future. Now,
I'm just a contender all the time. That's my personal preference.
You are not a contender all the time. You lost in the final, so you are a loser is what you are. You are a loser.
That's rude.
Before we get into the episode itself, we wanted to mention a few things. So I'd said on Twitter too that we had a few announcements. So the first one is we are launching a Patreon. Yay!
Hooray.
But we want to explain it a little bit. So it's not at all a money grab or anything. Our idea is that we always want to keep our content free, whether it's the tools or the draft kit stuff that we do, our episodes. We'll never put any podcasts behind the paywall. This is simply a way that if you want to help us out, it's there. And there's a few perks that come along with it that, again, are just kind of, we put in a lot of time. And if we want to put in extra time, we're willing to give people that, but for a little bit of a buck. So it's a $5 tier. That's the only one we have. Or if you want to be Jake Allen, we have the $666 tier that is
Please
known
don't
as...
ever do that.
Don't
It'll
do
make
that.
us very uncomfortable.
The tier is called the Devil. But don't do that tier. But anyways, the perks that it comes with is you get a private Discord channel that's with us, so that you can always kind of reach out to us for advice or anything like that. We're also going to open up listener leagues. So if you want to be in a listener league with us, we will each own a team ourselves because we don't know how to get along well enough to manage a team together. You can do that.
You make
too.
terrible decisions.
Yes, I do. So of course you wouldn't want to be on my team. We're also going to give you early access to beta stuff. So any tools that we kind of come up with, any spreadsheets, you get early access to that, early access to our draft stuff. Again, not necessarily content stuff. It's just as I'm building it, I'll put it up and you can get it at different versions if you want to play around with it and help find bugs or whatever. And yeah, that's about it. We're also going to end up hopefully doing some kind of merch stuff, and then patrons. Do you call them Patreons or patrons? I think it's patrons. Patrons would get a discount. We're still kind of figuring out what exactly that discount code is and how it would work, but we want to give you early access to kind of limited merch that we want to run, different swag stuff. So that's that. Again, as we always said before, right? Yes, and you can live listen while we record episodes, so you'll get access to our channel, so that if we'll put out our schedule, tell you when we're recording, you can tune in when we're recording. So it gives you a little bit of a leg up if you're free or want to be able to listen in as we're talking about who to pick up and whatnot during the season.
And you'll know when we made sneaky cuts because we screwed things up, which happens fairly often. Yeah, we do screw things.
So you also get to hear us curse and mess up, which you don't usually get on the final edit of the podcast. And then a few other things. Sorry, there's just so many announcements because this is officially the start of the season for us. So I want to make sure to get everything in. On Twitter, we put our schedule out. So make sure to go check that out and see when things are coming, what episodes we're going to put out, and give us feedback on any episodes that you think we're missing. We also have a Discord channel that has been really active. We're up to 50 people now. So be sure to join that. That's also on our Twitter. You can find a link there. And our Twitter is at what is it again?
At Fantasy Hockey PD.
There you go, Fantasy Hockey PD. I almost said at FHP. Not a thing. And lastly, The consistency sheet is almost done. I sent it out to our patrons today, our lovely 3 patrons so far at the time of recording this. Sent that out today so that they can play around with and start to get a feel for it. It's going to be really cool. I don't know yet how exactly you use it or how it benefits you. It does seem like there's some kind of correlation year to year between how consistent you are. So that's a good sign so far. And then on top of that, it'll be 3 years of data. So it'll be last year, the 2016 year, and the 2017 year. Why did those out of order? Makes 0 sense. This is why I probably should stop talking usually.
Because you're a confusing person and you do confusing things.
I usually get a little bit confusing. So anyways, that's all the announcements that we have. Just wanted to make sure to get all of that out there. And I've talked a lot. So you know what? Let's jump into the Dynasty and Keeper League strategy episode, because we didn't do one of these last year. So I'm actually really excited to see how we do and the advice that we come up with here. So let's start first with the drafting element of a Dynasty and Keeper League. The most fun part, and also arguably the most important part for your future season. So you usually, and you will, I know you will advocate for this very strongly. You always advocate for being a contender, and you yourself are a contender, usually in Keeper and Draft Leagues, or Dynasty Leagues. So you start us off with the contender bit, because I draft usually for middle of the pack. You usually draft for contender. So I think it's fair for both of us to kind of split up and talk about those 2 elements.
So I think going into this, I think the first thing you need to think about is what type of team you're building. You already mentioned this with the contender, middle of the pack, and the kind of rebuilder, and that's more about like, where are you trying to build like a dynasty team, a literal dynasty based on young players that are up and coming, that are going to be, the next Crosbys, the next whoever, Kucherovs and whatnot, and starting young and trying to attack for a long time coming? Or do you want to be get a more sure thing, which is my strategy, and go with sort of maybe a little bit older players, but players that can run you to a championship in the first year? Or you can go middle of the pack, which is your decision making, which is kind of a mixture of the 2. You're not totally averse to taking a vet, but you're probably going to drop him a little bit later than maybe somebody like I would. I think what I see a lot in drafting for Dynasty, and especially Dynasty Leagues, to a lesser extent Keeper Leagues, because they vary a bit depending on how many you're going to keep. But in Dynasty Leagues, a lot of people will fade veterans to the point that they fall to like absurd levels. Yes, they may only serve you for maybe 3 years. Talking about guys like Brent Burns or a guy like, Ovechkin, these players that are, you could say
on
they're
the
past
wrong
their
side
prime?
of 30, I guess.
Yeah, on the wrong side of 30. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. They're not necessarily past their prime, as we saw Brent Burns pick up his first point per game season just this past season, but they're still closer to aging out. And that makes them scary when you have guys like, Line A, and you've got guys like Jack Hughes now, and all these new players that are bringing a lot of interesting new games to the big game here. And you can take them early and kind of be set up for longer. I particularly don't take that strategy. I was able to get Ovechkin in the 9th in a banger league, rather a 9th round pick, or no, a 9th overall pick. Man, could you imagine if it was a 9th round?
That'd be insane.
But when you think about it, like you could pretty much assume in the same type of league that counts shots, hits, even just shots and hits, we can stop there. In a league that counts shots and hits as well as the regular points, Ovechkin is going to go probably top 4, should be top 3 in almost every like redraft league. So in Dynasty, from default to 9th overall, that's people essentially saying, okay, you're going to get 2 or 3 years out of him. I'm hoping for a little bit more than that, but at the same time, I know that those next few years are going to be really, really good. They're going to be elite level. They're going to be hard to beat. They're going to be top 3 overall pick for those 3 years. So I'm trying to build in such a way that, okay, my team is older compared to a lot of other teams. And I think this is what makes a contender early on, that you know that your players are already good despite the fact that they're older. And then the rest of the difficulty, your first few years, if you draft like this, should be relatively easy, honestly. A lot of teams are going to do the kind of rebuilder, quote unquote, strategy of taking a bunch of young guys and kind of waiting for them to age into their roles. If you do the contender strategy, you take some older players, you don't really worry about taking a guy like Bergeron a little later in the draft, because they are going to fall in dynasty leagues. The tough part is not the draft anymore. It's maintaining and trading, which we'll get into later. So I'm really focusing here on the contender piece, but the big part of it is not being afraid of veterans and trying to figure out when to draft them. And a lot of that's going to happen based on how the league itself is drafting. When you start seeing guys like, you see Darlene going, maybe something like 15th overall, which I think he did in our league. That's my first sign that, like, all right, people are really going young here. I might be able to take my vets even later and get sort of middle round guys, 26, 27-year-old guys earlier on, and then still have a shot at my older players later. Case in point, I was able to get Burns in the 4th round. So that's kind of my spiel. I could dig into it more, but how about you talk about the middle of the pack strategy for a bit?
Sure. And I think one thing, too, to mention that we always mention in any kind of strategy episode that we do is to remember to not take what we say as gospel and just get it so into your head that you need to do it X way. Like, say you go into a draft planning to be a rebuilder, and then you notice the rookies are just going a little too early. Don't be afraid to shift your strategy a little bit. Go with the flow of the draft. React to what people are doing. If people are taking rookies way too early, in your opinion, for how you value them, then you don't necessarily have to go down that route in terms of saying, okay, well, everyone else is getting rookies, I guess I got to get rookies too. It's the same thing with the goalie run. If everyone's getting goalies, it doesn't mean you have to take a goalie there. It just means that you need to make sure that you have a goalie lined up in the future that you're thinking about taking, and perhaps you can get some really good forward or defensive value that round that someone's missing out. Like, say someone leaves, according to your evaluations, a top 10 pick on the board, right? And instead a lot of people go goalies. It might not be worth taking a goalie. It's probably worth it to take that top 10 overall pick according to your value, at least, or your spreadsheet, whatever the hell you're using to draft, instead of going with the flow. And so I think that's a really important thing. And I think with middle of the pack people, that's even more important because you're doing two things, right? You're trying to find value. I think the way I look at it is you're trying to find the max value at peak players now. So you're trying to find people who are either in their prime, just slightly past their prime, but offer a ton of value for their draft position. And then when it comes to rookies, for me at least, I target specific rookies who will fit out my team. So if I look at the way that I'm building my team from the top down in terms of who's going to play right now. So for example, in our Dynasty League, what we did, I got an Alexander Barkov, I got a Sean Monahan, I ended up drafting Jamie Benn in the 1st round, which now, not so hot of an idea, not so great. But the idea was that you get Jamie Benn, who rounds out your team really, really nicely. So now I can go get scores. And I got like a Shane Gostisbehere and a Torrey Krug. Okay, cool. My defensive forwards are doing pretty hot there. Good. So I tried to kind of round out my team with very good, valuable players up top. Not so great middle ground guys. But the idea is that hopefully in the future, I can have these guys, the very NHL ready soon guys, come up. So for example, you've got like guys like Andres. Wow, I can't say his name. Andrei Svechnikov, who can come up. Evan Bouchard, Quinn Hughes. So these guys who I hope will come up and kind of fill that gap between my best players and the next best player. And I think that's kind of how middle of the pack works. Is you're still contender. Maybe you're kind of fighting for a playoff spot. And the way I view it is it's not even that you're fighting for a playoff spot or not fighting for a playoff spot. You're just kind of pivoting on how your rookies do. If your rookies do as well as you hope they do, then you're a playoff contender and maybe even a contender for the cup. If they don't do so well, you're probably missing the playoffs like I did this year.
Yeah, I think the biggest danger of middle of the pack play is becoming Minnesota.
Yes, 100%.
The last playoff spot that you get knocked out in the 1st round every season.
And I have a solution for that because I kind of did something similar this year because I took over a keeper team, and in the team that I took over, it was very kind of middle of the pack. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to go middle of the pack for the season, see what I can do, see how far I can get, see how good the teams get at the top, that kind of thing, and feel it out, and then see what I'll do. So I'll get into like the trading part of what I did there because I think that's a perfect example of how middle of the pack you kind of trade or build later to not be Minnesota. Like you do need to be cognizant when you're in middle of the pack. It's hard. I think it's harder than either rebuilder or contender simply because, yes, like you said, there's a very, very strong chance that you end up just mediocre in either direction, or you're just inconsistent. One year you have an amazing team, the next year you don't have an amazing team, and that's tough to build for. But when it comes to the draft, I think the way really you want to structure it is that those first few rounds for me, I'm not taking rookies. But what I did do was that I had specific rookies I was eyeing because of my league's categories. So I had an idea, for example, that Darlene was going to go high. That was fine with me. I was eyeing Bouchard, who I thought added not as much value as Darlene, but similar value because I had taken guys like Krug and Gostisbehere. And because of that, I can wait a little bit and get him a little bit later and take some value in other rounds. And the same thing with Andrei Svechnikov. And for example, I think goalies in our league were very, very highly sought after. So I just paid attention to when the first goalie went. And as soon as that first goalie went, that first rookie goalie, which was Samsonov, as I expected, I immediately took heart on that next turn for me. And then after that, I also took Shesterkin to guarantee that I would have 2 just really, really elite goaltenders, because that's what I wanted. I wanted 2 elite goaltenders for the future, and then ended up with really old goaltenders aside from Connor Hellebuck. To Connor Hellebuck, I think my goalie situation is probably the perfect example of a middle of the pack where I took Connor Hellebuck really, really early. I think he was my 2nd round pick or something like that after Vasilevsky. I really liked him, loved kind of the team he's on for the future. I don't think he's going to sacrifice starts in the next few years. So Connor Hellebuck to me was the perfect starting goaltender spot. Cool.
I took him ahead of John Gibson, you maniac.
I can sit on him for a long time. I don't like the Ducks. So I can sit on him for a long time and not worry about goaltenders. After that, I took Craig Anderson and Henrik Lundqvist. Lundqvist, just because of shot volume, we count saves. He's good for saves. Same with Craig Anderson. Not a lot of wins, gets me a ton of saves. And between those 3, I actually was lights out in goaltending for the year. And then after that, I made sure to get Carter Hart and Igor Shesterkin. So between that whole set, I have what I like to think of as a perfect first-year goaltending situation, a perfect second-year situation where Carter Hart is ready to play. Maybe Shesterkin is going to get some minutes. And then next year, I'm in an even better situation where I've now got Connor Hellebuck, Carter Hart, and Igor Shesterkin. And that's what you want to do as a middle of the pack team, in my opinion, is you're not necessarily the best core that first year, but you're thinking 2, maybe 1, 2, 3 years down. I would say 1 or 2 years down the line, you're in a really, really good spot and have elite players. And so I think that's just what it is. It's picking your spots and what kind of elite players do you want. I like power play heavy forwards or offensive defensemen too. Like
power
for example,
play
Quinn Hughes and Evan Bouchard.
Power play points is pretty much the premier stat that I like to pick, because it's going to give you at least one other stat in either a goal or assist, and possibly more depending on how your stats line out. But typically targeting good power play players is a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, and that's I remember when we did our Dynasty draft, that's one thing we talked about a lot offline while the draft was going on, was we kept looking for who's going to potentially be able to move into a power play spot. And if they really didn't have a shot at ever moving into the power play spot, I personally didn't really care much for them, especially on defense. Because the thing is, in defense, when you're looking for peripherals, especially in a league as deep as let's say a Dynasty league with I don't know even how deep our league is. We have like a 14-player bench or minor roster, so it's pretty deep. You can pick up peripherals pretty easily. And then the other thing I did was that I got peripheral defensemen such as like Alec Martinez, Chris Russell, Justin Schultz, who really I know aren't very good. But in the meantime, and for a long time, they will fill the needs that I need, which are hits. Some of them will do, but they'll get a lot of blocks. Whatever I need kind of in that peripheral department, they do, which is good. And I can find people to replace those specific peripherals pretty easily. So I didn't mind too much about specific peripheral damages, if that makes sense. And I think that's really the key thing. So I think that made sense. It's kind of the first time. I worry about
peripherals a little bit, but I'm still targeting, especially in defense, I'm targeting power play players.
But that comes a lot too from like multi-cap monsters, right? If you can get them, like Jamie Benn to me I was hoping he would be a multi-cap monster, and in a league as deep as a Dynasty usually is, any guy like that, Andrew Shaw is a multi-cap monster. The guys like Patrick Hornquist, like those guys I got specifically because I wanted my older guys to be multi-cap monsters, and then I can find those guys later on too through other drafts.
I picked up Adam Larson and Matt Martin. I mean, if you need hits, they pretty much cover you by themselves.
I remember when he took Matt Martin. That was a very bold strategy.
It was like a 22nd round. It was fine.
Yeah,
I'm kind of surprised he didn't go earlier than that, because he did pretty well in hits.
That is true. That is true.
But I was just looking at my draft. The only players that I got that were like even remotely young were John Gibson and Jake Allen. Everybody else was like 27 plus.
Yeah.
But I'll talk about my trade strategy a little bit, because I have made a couple of trades at the aim of slowly.
Well, hold on. Before we go into trades,
I'm not going to go into trades. I'm just saying.
Yeah, let's go into rebuilder.
Yeah.
So
I
go
hate
first
the
with your
idea
thought.
of rebuilder strategy, like starting from a super young core. I feel like you're gambling too much. If you draft this wrong, you're screwed for so long. That's the biggest fear. Like, you could really put your team in almost an unwinnable position. And I think I think this is the easiest trap to fall into. People will do this without realizing it. You'll start targeting only players that are like 19 or 20 or 21 or whatever, like first year in the league type players. So especially now, I'm sure next year we're going to see Elias Pettersson going in like first rounds for Dynasty and stuff, which
that's a bad example.
I mean, he okay, yeah, it might be, but it's still, I just worry about stuff like that. I mean, Besser, for example, right? I'm sure he started going really, really early, and now he's like had a couple injuries and he plays a little bit differently. It's just enough. I don't like, I don't like going that young. I mean, we saw Darlene go I think it was second round.
First pick, second round, yeah.
So that's essentially like a late first round pick almost, since it's the same team. And it's scary to me. Like, yes, you might have just drafted the next Erik Karlsson or something, but you may not have. I hate that strategy. I hate it. And when you see those guys like Darlene drafted in our redraft league, something like 12th round. So it makes you think that, like, okay, year one, people have almost no value on him. He's a total gamble, and you're hoping that he will get better and better and better, and he probably will. But the guy you're looking for him to become is still on the board, man. Karlsson was still there. He's only like 27. So it's like that type of stuff just drives me crazy. People will overvalue youth to a crazy extent when they don't have proven numbers yet. They have one season. They have 0 seasons under their belt, and people are still making these crazy grabs.
Now, if you are dead set on being a rebuilder, though, my one strategy there and advice would be, from knowing other people who have done it successfully and whatnot, it's simply you have to commit to it. I think the thing that I see the biggest mistake, for example, you see this guy who took Darlene in the second round, first pick, and then he didn't take a rookie forever, and then he was stuck with his next best rookie that he took off the board was Ryan Donato. That's just not good. So, you get into this realm where you're trying to be young, but then you don't commit to it. It's weird. So I think if you're trying to go that route where you're actually willing to take a Darlene in that second round, just commit to it and be the guy who literally takes every single rookie. Just like have an idea of who the best rookies are, who you want. Just take them all. And that might actually end up helping you out, because if people realize that's happening, they're going to. I'm just saying, if you're going to go that true rebuilder route, my advice is just commit to it and go crazy with it, because that's the only way it's really going to work. Because if you just have a bunch of middle of the ground rebuilder picks, you're not going to do that hot. And again, like if you wait to be more of a rebuilder, you take a few, rookies here or there, and then you wait to take them until later again, you're going to get beat to a lot of the guys you want. Instead, just go into the draft with the idea you're going to get rookies before anybody else. And that, in my opinion, that's the only way to really do a rebuilder in the proper way.
I will say,
you go all in.
I highly, highly recommend not ever doing this. I think the only two options are contender or middle of the pack, the way we're describing it here. If you're only looking at young players and like everybody else is like invisible to you, the odds of you building a team that is 6-7 years out of being able to do anything is fairly high, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah, I definitely don't recommend this, but if I were going to do a rebuild, like if I had a gun to my head, someone said you need to be a rebuilding fantasy team, how would I do it? This is how I'd do it. I'd just go all out, be a true rebuilder, and get the best young guys I can possibly get.
Since we are talking about drafting, let's talk about drafting a little bit in future years. So this is a position where maybe I agree with you a little bit more as far as going super young. Now that my team is, getting older, the guys I'm looking for are like premier players that are boom or bust, Josh Hosang types. So I know I'm not going to be able to draft like the best rookies because I won't have the position. I won't. Yep. There's no way I'm trading for a number one pick or anything. So I'm going to be winding up getting like, the 15th best rookie or whatever for each year. So the guys I'm looking at are the ones that are lighting it up but have some problems. And they're the ones that may make it on and turn into like an Artemi Panarin if you get super lucky, which, I mean, this is like the dream, right? But odds are they just fizzle. But that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the guy that, because other than that, it's a lottery ticket anyway. So I don't really care if they wind up being a third liner or they miss the NHL. It's the same thing to me for fantasy. So I'd rather have the chance at them being a first liner or missing completely rather than a really good chance of them being a third liner. Yep. So that's how I go into the draft as a team that is going to have not the best picks, most likely, because I already have relatively good positioning, assuming the season went well, which it usually does. So there is that strategy of it's interesting to look at the draft when you're doing your following year drafts, especially if you only draft, for example, like the 2019 rookies this season. When you get into like rounds 2 and 3 and such, you really are just grasping at straws. It's going to be very, very difficult to find fantasy relevant players that went in the later rounds. You sent me a spreadsheet at some point, I can't remember where we found it, of how many players even make the NHL from the second round and beyond. And it takes years for them to make it, and they usually don't wind up being fantasy relevant. So
I think this was from Dauber Prospects, and it was something about how on average only 2 players from every draft play the following year. That's it. And then in the last, I think 4 or 5 years or something, I want to say no second rounder or beyond pick is played in the following year that they were drafted.
Yeah. So played past their ELC slide or whatever it is.
Yeah. So you have to remember that like it takes a while for these guys to actually get to the NHL. So for me, my pick strategy too, when that gets to it, is yes, I like boomer bust, but I also like boomer bust where the person, you're going to know if that person is a bust or a boom pretty soon. As opposed to like, okay, I'll know, like, I think Dal Cole is a great example of someone who, God, you've been waiting years, just insane amount of years to see whether he's a boom or a bust. And
so I think that strategy is interesting because it's a little bit different. That strategy as a middle of the pack makes more sense because the immediate help kind of matters a little bit more. You kind of want them to break in quicker. For me, I don't really care. If they take 2 or 3 years, that's kind of the timeline for me right now. So it sort of makes sense. And it opens up doors. Obviously, the guys that we're talking about that are likely to make it earlier on are typically going to go a little higher than the guys that are truly a project. But yeah.
I like
Should we
it.
move on?
Yeah, I think we've nailed a lot of things down on that drafting strategy.
Raise more questions than anything. People are gonna be like, "What should I do again?"
Now I'm rethinking my entire draft. I don't know if that's a healthy thing or a non-healthy thing. Nah, I'm happy with the team I built. Okay, let's move on to maintaining / keeping. So I think the big part of this is who do you keep? So
yeah,
when you get into that decision for, as a contender, I think that's pretty easy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems the keeping part is, well, it can be or can't be, because you can also have in a 5-team keeper league where you keep only 5. It can get pretty tough to decide if you just won the cup. You probably had many people who helped you get there.
Yep.
It's pretty tough to decide who to keep.
So as keepers get like shallower and shallower, I'm less and less interested in youth, honestly, because there's going to be so many breakouts every season. Somebody's going to wind up being keeper, like Pedersen. I don't think people necessarily expected him to be a keeper immediately, but he is. And there's going to be guys like that come through season after season and are going to break into your top 5 ranks or whatever. So for me, I would keep whoever I think is going to do the best the next season. It's like kind of that simple. I don't really think about multiple years ahead if there's only 4 or 5 keepers or whatever. I just think about what is the very best thing I can do for next season, and then you'll make the decision again that year.
Yeah. I think the thing too with a contender is sometimes you can get caught up in forgetting that your core is what won you the cup. Right? Like that core that you kept from the beginning, or just the best players. And so don't think about it as, oh, well, but maybe this player won me the cup, so I can move on. I think that happens a lot too, where it's like, oh, I won the cup, I think it's time to move on from Crosby. You're not the real life team. Like, it doesn't work like that. Crosby is still consistent as hell. And personally, I think what you do is that you're in a position of strength, you reduce your risk, which we've always talked about, reduce your risk for the next year. There's no better way to do that than just take the guys that are the most consistent. And maybe not necessarily what I'm talking about with the consistency sheet that we're doing, different kind of consistent, where you just know that they're going to be a top 20 player. For the most part, you know that. And that's really what you want to do. As the
keepers increase, you should be looking more and more towards youth, because then you really do have to make a decision of, okay, who do I need to keep for the next 3-5 years? Right? Like if you have like 10 keepers, then there's going to be guys on your team that are going to last however many years, probably at least a handful. So then you might start looking at younger players a little bit more. An interesting scenario here would be, do you keep a guy like Line on like a keep 4? And I would not say he's a guarantee, honestly. I think once you get to like keep 6, then but keep 4, I'm still putting him somewhere in the 4th to 5th round value for this season coming up. just because we saw what can happen if he can't get his head around whatever's happening. The Jets don't have a center right now again for him, and it's a little perilous. And if I'm only keeping 4 players, I just don't know. It would have to depend on who I have, but I definitely wouldn't say he's safe. Whereas as you get deeper, he gets, I mean, obviously you have more picks, so he starts getting safer, but to a later extent, I would say like if you had a guy, well, this always gets complicated because as you get more picks, obviously you're going to save more players or keep more players.
I think the thing is though,
but
I think the basis of the strategy or the advice for contender is simply reduce your risk. Play it safe. Don't be stupid. There's no reason to take any risks. You have a contending team, a core that clearly won you the cup. Don't be stupid. Just play it safe, reduce your risk from the get-go, and you're already in a point of strength for next season.
Yep. And I think, this maintaining keeping stuff does kind of tie into trades a bit. So I think as a contender, it's the youth that you might be looking to trade a little bit more. And I mean, obviously you don't want to build like a team of 35-year-olds or something, but those younger players, those line A's, they can get you a player that might be even more worth keeping for your team for next season, where that player might benefit another team, or just may look better to a team that's looking to keep line A long term. So I'm not necessarily advocating for trading line A if you're a good team. It really depends on the situation, how many keepers you have. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad option either. And on the other hand, if you don't think you'll be at the level to compete next season, or that your keepers just aren't quite there yet, then you might be looking to trade your older players, your Crosbys, your Giroux, for really solid younger players that can move up. Like maybe you trade Crosby for something like, oh boy, I don't even want to make an example because I'll make a fool of myself.
Yeah, no,
like
don't.
Aho,
I don't think you want to go down that route.
Yeah, I mean, but I feel like Aho would be a pretty decent example.
Sure.
I don't necessarily know that that's a 1-to-1 trade at this point, but you're looking at a guy that's 24 to a guy that's 32, I think. So depending on how many keepers you have, that's not exactly lopsided at all. Just matters what you need to get, and that trade goes one way or the other depending on what you're expecting for next season, I think.
Yep. Now moving on to middle of the pack. So this is where I'm at in my keeper league, and I think that the thing with middle of the pack is, and this will tie into trading, I think, after, but in my opinion, if you're a middle of the pack, there's two. Middle of the pack also splits, right? Because if you're a middle of the pack who made the playoffs and made a run for it, it might be a little bit tougher to make your picks on who you're keeping, simply because, well, you made the cup, or you made the final, you made the playoffs, finals, whatever it is. So now you've got a pretty good team. It's a little harder to choose. The other route that you can take is you didn't make the playoffs and you have a pretty good set of who you want. So my idea, and this will tie into trading later, is I think that regardless of what way you want, whether you go, I want to make the playoff, or I want to compete in the playoffs, or I'm not going to make the playoffs, I think either way, before the playoffs start, or before the trade deadline, I don't even think it's the playoffs, the trade deadline, you should know who your 5 keepers are. Because the whole season, if you're a middle of the pack person, you should have a core that you're building around and have an idea of who that core is and start building for that core, if that makes sense. If you go into it without knowing that, it can get a little tough. Whereas, in my opinion, the best way I think of it is, say you can really trade perfectly for the core that you want, then it's pretty easy to build the team around them. But I think you should have it set by the time you get to the deadline. So that's what I did. I ended up not making the playoffs, but I realized that really early. And so I just started figuring out, who do I want to be my keepers for next year. So my keepers for this year in this team will end up being Brent Burns, Connor McDavid, Patrick Kane, Taylor Hall, and Andrei Vasilevsky. So we'll get into it in the trading situation later, just because I can explain how I got Taylor Hall, how I got Vasilevsky. I didn't start with Hall, Vasilevsky, or Brent Burns. So those 3 I traded or did a lot of trading to get to. But that's kind of the idea, I think, is that either way, whether you go to the playoffs and compete or you miss the playoffs, as a keeper, you want to know who your keepers are. So, and let's say now you don't know who your keepers are. So you didn't do that last season. I think that's okay. And I think ultimately what you want to do is see how many players you have that will reduce risk. If you only have 4, that's fine. That next one, who has the highest ceiling? I would just go for highest ceiling guy, honestly.
Yep.
I think that there's no reason to keep someone who's easily replaceable. I think that's when you start looking at, okay,
or
let's say,
depending.
or goaltender. Like look at an Ekblad, for example, right? Like let's say Ekblad is your next best defenseman or something like that. He doesn't have a high ceiling. So I'd rather go for a boom or bust guy.
He doesn't have a ceiling at all.
Fine. He doesn't have a ceiling at all. But what I'm saying is go for
At
the
least
guy
he
who's
lives in
a
a very small
ceiling
box that floats right at like 42 points.
And he has a shelf. The only thing he has of decoration in there is a shelf full of vanilla.
Yep. Vanilla extract, as far as I can see.
Oh, man. And then for rebuilder, it's pretty easy, honestly, I think, as far as who you keep. I think I don't even think we really need to get into it. If you're a rebuilder,
it's kind of a gamble strat. You're trying to keep guys that are going to improve drastically over the course of the next year or two. Typically, in a keeper league, in a dynasty league, we're not even talking about keeping, right? We're basically you're going to have all your guys anyway. So, but in a keeper league, this is assuming it's fairly deep. You just keep.
I mean, I think
keep
a good
young
example
guys that have high upside
is the guy who was last in our league, in this keeper league last year, has a pretty awful squad, honestly. I'm looking at it right now and it's pretty brutal. And so this is a good example. I think Mark Scheifele is an automatic keeper here. Patrick Laine is an automatic keeper for him. Again, we keep 5.
Yep.
And then you look at Sean Couturier is an automatic keeper. Yep. Dylan Larkin's an automatic keeper.
Yep.
And you also got to think about positions here too, right? Because that right there is 3 centers.
I will
put you in trouble.
I will say one thing. This is a totally tangential, but Sean Couturier is good. He's good.
Oh yeah, he is. Yes, he is.
Nobody seems to care still, but yeah, he's good.
And that's the other thing I think to plan on. And actually, we didn't touch on this in the drafting part, and we should have, but also in keeping, pay attention to your positions.
Yeah.
Always. I don't like the idea necessarily of I'm going to draft all the goalies and then I have all the leverage to trade the goalies. No, you're trading from a position of weakness because everyone knows you have the goalies. No one's going to pay because they know eventually you have to give them up for something. So it's the same thing. Like there's no point keeping 3 centers. Like this person in our league shouldn't have had all those 3 centers. By the trade deadline, they should have figured out which 2 centers they wanted to keep and tried to move something for a better winger. That's what I would have done. And I guess we're kind of moving into the trading bit there, but that's
Should we
really...
grab this fan question real quick?
Yeah, might as well. So one person has a specific question which asked, they were curious about when you think it would be a good time to trade away some aging keepers such as Crosby or Giroux. So what's your take on that?
You know, I'm actually trying to look up how old Giroux is. I feel like he's 32 probably, or 33 maybe. He might be 31, which at that point, I don't even consider him that old, to be fair. But I think this depends on where you were in your draft last season. If you're already kind of dominating with your team, I don't think now is the time to move either of those guys. If you're not, and you think you probably won't be able to win next season, if there's like, you know, a team that's stacked out right now with older players or whatever, that's maybe when you start looking at trading these guys for, a younger up, like a Scheifele, like we just mentioned, or Aho or a Larkin, all these players that, because we're talking about centers here well, I guess Drew's a wing now, huh? But for Crosby, right, you might replace him with an Aho or a Larkin or something. Again, the point here would be to trade them to a team that likely is going to win or, is in a contender spot, and trying to take their best young pieces, hopefully more than one that you can keep, and turn them into even better players later down the line. So it's hard to answer that question straight up. Odds are if you have both Crosby and Giroux, your team's probably pretty good, I'm guessing. So I probably would not move them. But if you have Crosby and Giroux and the rest of your team is garbage, then maybe you move both of them or one of them, whichever's older, for younger pieces. Like it would be an interesting move to trade Giroux for a package involving Couturier. Then you still have exposure to Giroux if you do like him or if you like the Flyers or whatever. And you get a piece that is doing pretty much, not as well as Giroux, but he's keeping up. He's up there. He's, nearly a point per game for 2 seasons straight, and he's 26. So that's an option that you could explore depending. And a lot of people value Couturier extremely low. And these are the targets you're going to be wanting to go after. Guys like Couturier, who is playing very well. There's no reason to assume he won't be playing well again next season. And he's young and he's underrated. Dylan Larkin's another great example of that. Aho, I feel like people have figured out about at this point.
I think that my take on that is a little bit different in that I think Giroux, yes, I wouldn't say. My take in a keeper league usually is I will almost never trade somebody simply because they're aging. Like, fear of age is not something I do if I'm only keeping 5 people, usually. I'm trying to think of the best example, like Ovechkin, for example. What if you would have traded him?
31, by the way.
Okay, but let's use an example. Like, I think Crosby, for example, is someone I would never trade, hands down. Just I wouldn't trade as a keeper unless the offer was absolutely insane. He's the most surefire player you have.
Yeah,
maybe, but again,
it
the
all
offer needs to blow me away.
So the correct answer here is to find a deal that you realize is about age and that they don't. You want to get as even a deal, even like as it looks right now, as they're playing right now, which is why I mentioned Couturier. You want to make a deal that looks good, even if they were the same age, and also DH yourself. That's the correct move, in my opinion. If you are not able to, if you think keeping Crosby is not going to make you a winning team next season, that's the route I would take. You're taking a little bit risk just because a younger player. I mean, yeah, they're probably going to stay good, but like look at Larkin. We don't really know. He's really, really good, but Detroit's Detroit. They don't have a left winger for him. So he's not as safe as Crosby, who's proven himself over a decade now. It's not to say he won't put up the same points. I actually think he will, but he is inherently a little bit more risky.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just always, I don't like just trading a guy away simply because of age. I think that's, I don't want to say, I think there's tiers, right? Like I'm thinking of like the Ovechkins and the Crosbys. I wouldn't trade those guys away because Brent Burns, of course, Brent Burns. Like those guys are just so consistent that until they prove me wrong, I think I could live with keeping a Brent Burns and he burns me. Ha. See what I did there? Oh, God. But I could definitely live with that. I'd be okay with it. But trading him away simply because of age and then getting burned on the other side of it where my trade doesn't work out, but he continues to be amazing for 3 years, that would hurt.
I'll be honest. I have him in our Dynasty League, and if I was not pretty sure that I win next season, I would be not necessarily exploring, but I might knock on a couple doors about moving Burns. I know there's a lot of interest, and I just think that with a player his caliber, you can get a haul back.
Well, so, that's what I'm saying, right? I would only do it for a true haul. I wouldn't do it solely because if you go to a person and it's clear that you're going there to negotiate simply because of age, you're going to get slaughtered. Yeah. You need to value them at advertising what they are.
Your older players, you will get called for it. People will understand what you're doing.
Don't undervalue your play. Like a Crosby, for example, should not be undervalued because of his age, given what he's still doing on the ice. So when you go to trade him, you should still trade. The negotiating process that you take, to me at least, is you should be trading him as though you're trading an Aho. Age doesn't matter. I mean, age matters a little bit, but for the most part, it doesn't matter. To you, it shouldn't matter. You should be willing to stand your ground and say, nope, he's still an amazing player, and he's probably going to be the same player for the next 3 years.
At least.
But don't trade him just from a position of he's old, I don't want him, or I need to move on.
Talking about being in positions of weakness and stuff, as we deal with trades, especially in Dynasty and Keeper Leagues, that is where you're going to get the best value. And there's ways you can do this where both teams win the trade. I know that sounds weird. It's not weird. If you have 6 centers and you only can start 4 of them and you're short on defense and you find a team that's short on centers and are heavy on defense, you can make a trade that is super even and both teams win. Just like it's that simple. So when for example, in our Dynasty League, I've been looking for a center for a while now. And I know that I'm fairly heavy on wing and I'm fairly heavy on defense. Not super heavy, but enough that they're a little bit more expendable considering what I need. Now, I don't want to go out there and be like, hey, everybody, I am desperate for a center and just allow people to roll me over the coals. But I do know what I need. And so what I'm doing is targeting teams that I think are a little weaker in wing and a little heavy in center. And lucky for me, center tends to be the heaviest position. So I'm looking at any team that has very poor defense or even mediocre defense, and the same with wings, and then to a lesser extent goaltending. So you want to apply your strengths, especially things that you're so strong that it's detrimental. If you're benching good players, that's very bad. And using that to leverage yourself into making your team more complete, filling your holes while not losing trades outright. That's kind of the mantra to take into it. it's not that hard, especially in dynasty leagues if they're really deep, to find teams that are lacking in a place that you have an advantage or have more players to fill that role, especially if you break out center, left wing, right wing.
So continuing this kind of bit on trading, I'll talk a little bit about what I did in my keeper league, because remember that I was explaining, decide before the trade deadline which way you want to go, whether you want to be a contender in the playoffs or whether you want to be a schmuck and miss the playoffs. In my situation, I knew I was a schmuck. I knew I was going to miss the playoffs. So instead of trying to go out and make trades to improve my roster as a whole, I didn't really give up. Like, my team was still competitive. I still had an upset or two, but for the most part, I accepted, you know what, I'm going to suck. That's it. Like, I need to get the guys I want. So instead of going out with it and trying to just destroy my team and get picks, I don't really care that much about picks, to be honest. I think that if you look at what a value of, say, a 5th round pick, 6th round pick usually is, a lot of people end up dropping 7th, 8th round picks for the most part in leagues. And so when you think about that from a keeper league, imagine what a 6th round pick is after you've kept 5 or 6. The odds of you dropping that guy eventually are very high. So I think people tend to overvalue picks for the most part. Usually. So it's not, so I'm not necessarily afraid to dole out picks, but I try to do it in a smart way. So what I did this year in my keeper league, which is a little sneaky, but I liked, was that I moved around players and tried to get exactly who I wanted as my keeper. So I wanted these 5 keepers. I wasn't super keen on Patrick Kane as my keeper, but I also wasn't against it. I thought, you know what, he might have a few more good years. I think Chicago's rounding out the team a little bit better. So I made a lot of moves this year to get exactly who I wanted. And early on in December is when I decided I really want Vasilevsky. So I actually had traded away Patrick Kane and my 4th rounder for Andre Vasilevsky and an 8th rounder. So I got the first guy I really wanted, which was Andre Vasilevsky. Then after that, I really wanted Vladimir Tarasenko, which I traded for Tarasenko by trading away Ben and Tays and Rask and getting Talbot in return with Tarasenko and Trocheck. So that was cool because I took on Trocheck.
You made that sound real weird for a second.
Yeah, I did. I know.
I thought you traded all 3 of those guys for Talbot. I'm like,
I know. I did that on purpose. But anyways, and then one of the big trades I made towards the end, this was February 7th, which was really close to the trade deadline. I made 2 trades on February 7th that were big ones to end up getting the players that I wanted. But one big one was I got Taylor Hall. So he was on IR. The guy was competing. And this is a really important thing. If you decide to go the route of not being a contender, target people that are contending, because if you're not happy with your core,
especially injuries like you're mentioning here.
Yeah, if you're not happy with your core, you should be willing to overpay for a guy that you really, really want and you are 100% sure are going to keep next year. If, say, you're getting a Taylor Hall or you're getting a Patrick Kane or an Andre Vasilevsky and you don't think you're going to make the playoffs, who cares if you give up your 7th best forward for it? Not saying that you should get fleeced, but all I'm saying is that you shouldn't be willing to walk away from the deal simply because you're giving away a chance to compete and be a little bit better that year, but still make the playoffs.
You're talking about give somebody like close to value in Hall and then plus another player that you're essentially losing, right?
Yes. So at the time, like for Hall, I mean, an injured player that's not going to play for the rest of the season, but is obviously a keeper. I gave up Hoffman and Riddick, which this was at the time that Riddick was incredible and this guy needed goalies. That to me is probably an overpay for a player that's on IR, of course, but I know I'm keeping him for a fact.
Yep.
I also traded Patrick Kane for Tavares straight up. That was fun. And then after that, the other one I did is just to get some picks back. I did Alexander Barkov for William Karlsson, where he paid me in picks pretty much and a slight pick upgrades for getting Alexander Barkov.
William Karlsson?
Because I didn't have room for Alexander Barkov.
You traded.
But here's what happens.
William Karlsson.
Listen.
Gamby.
Hold on. You're not letting me finish my spiel here. I was not keeping Alexander Barkov and I wanted to upgrade picks because my picks were in dire shape here after trying to get, Patrick Kane, Vasilevsky and all this, right? I was in shambles pick-wise. I wasn't keeping Barkov. He was literally being benched all the time because of my center situation with McDavid, and at the time was Tavares and Trocheck. I literally didn't play Barkov. So what did I end up doing? I just ended up moving Barkov for William Karlsson, which got me a left wing slot and upgraded picks by quite a bit. So because I upgraded picks, I knew I wasn't keeping him, and this was right at the end of the season. It didn't matter. This is what I'm saying. Build out your team for next year. Like, don't be afraid to go into that trade deadline with the idea of, I'm going to blow it all up. I'm going to blow it all up and get the perfect or as perfect as you can get core for you, and then be ready for next year. Like, I feel like I'm in a fantastic spot going into next year with Patrick Kane, Connor McDavid, who also have Vasilevsky, Brent Burns. I feel I'm in a fantastic spot going into next year. And on top of that,
you traded for William Karlsson.
And I used some of those players that I knew I wouldn't keep to upgrade picks. I'm in a fantastic spot for next year. And that's what I'm saying happens. Like, it's okay to throw away a season, in my opinion, in the keeper league if you really know you're not going to make the playoffs. And there's a pivotal moment where you need to make the decision which one you're going to be. Don't be the Minnesota Wild, where you don't think you're going to make the playoffs, but then you do some stupid Niederreiter trade that really gets you nowhere, but kind of makes you worse, but leaves you in the same spot. You don't want to do that. And so that's
going on the first round of the playoffs is pretty much might even be worse depending on your lottery system than just losing.
That's my bit, I think, on trading, at least from a keeper league standpoint, is know which way you're going. And then if you know you're going to be a contender, or you know you're going to contend in the playoffs, my stance on that is don't trade simply for depth. You still need to know who your 5 keepers are, and those 5 keepers should cost an absolute fortune to rip away from you.
Yep.
Absolute fortune.
For trading, I think this next bit I'm going to talk about here is actually a combination of contender and rebuilder trading. In dynasty leagues, if you're expecting to be a contender for the next several years, like I am now, my picks. So the picks are only for, I think it's all free agency. Essentially, winds up pickable, but essentially the people that you're going to be drafting are the ones that have just entered the player pool, meaning the 2019 draft class. As a contender, the only pick that really feels like it matters, assuming you're not snaking, is your first round pick. After that, they are lottery tickets. I wouldn't say they're worthless, but like
they're up there.
You can pick somebody on free agency that's in the minors and probably have as good a shot as somebody you drafted, 30th overall in a 2019 draft class league. So it's you at that point you're so far down that maybe I could see an argument for making your second round pick feel a little bit valuable, but not really. So my strategy was I knew that me drafting 15th overall or whatever it was, 13th overall, or I expected to be 14th because I expected to win, but I didn't. So 13th overall with my first pick in the 2019 draft class was not as valuable to me as it would be to somebody else who is just trying to, grab as many prospects as they can. So I offered basically all of my picks, quote unquote, mortgaging my future. I didn't really see it that way, as the trades that I made were for players a little bit younger. I wasn't necessarily trading for guys that were 34 or 35 anymore. I was angling for, I wound up getting Mark Stone, Darnell Nurse in some of these trades that involved I think my first round pick and Jason Robertson plus a couple players got me Mark Stone and Darnell Nurse. Actually, I think I got from the same person. So the whole idea was I knew that these picks, especially being so late in the rounds, were not as valuable as a lot of people will think they are. And as a rebuilder, you should be able to target the picks of a good contender with your kind of middle ground pieces that might not help you in the long term. So you can be able to target, a first round pick from a contender, which is a mediocre pick, and you need to make them aware that that it's a mediocre pick, and a player that is maybe a little younger but has upside to it for one of your, middle ground players. Maybe let's call them relatively good players that will help the contender in the immediate future, especially if it's an older player. So that's how like a rebuilder and a contender can work together, and another way that both teams can win the trade. So the rebuilder gives away a piece that may not help them by the time they're ready to make a run, and they give the piece to a contender, which helps them immediately. The rebuilder doesn't care because they're not competing anyway, and they get back a pick or two plus a younger player to increase the likelihood that their rebuild is successful. And that's the whole plan. That's the game. That's what you got to do when you're in rebuild. You have to realize that trying to make a push and get yourself into playoffs just to get blown out before you even make it to the money is not really worth it. And just kind of swallow your pride for a season or two and build a team that will be able to come back and contend sooner than later.
Okay, so that about wraps it up for the most part in what we have to say. I don't have much to add there. I think that one good thing real quick is we can wrap this up really quick. So I think that the key with drafting is understanding where you are and what kind of a team you want to be and finding value as normal. I think it's like any other draft. The big difference is that you can go many, many different directions because it's just a deeper draft and you have a lot of decisions to make on when do you want to be a contender, 1 year, 2 years, immediately. Brandon and honestly myself would argue you should always aim to be a contender immediately or at most within 1 or 2 years. So I always vouch for contender or middle of the pack. I like both of those. I chose middle of the pack just because I wanted to give myself a challenge and I knew it'd be harder, which in hindsight now makes me feel kind of stupid.
You just love losing to me, that's all.
I do like losing to you, and I do it quite often. For maintaining and keeping, like we said, I think a lot of it is reducing your risk. Similar to when you draft, you want your keepers to reduce your risk. And the big thing is that at either you want to know by the trade deadline, a little bit before, you want to know who your 5 keepers are, or at best, you want to know who you're targeting to round out your keepers. And for trading, lastly, you want to make sure that you're targeting the right players and you're using all the leverage you can. Age, while a factor, shouldn't be that much of a factor. Make sure to value your players properly. Don't devalue players too much because of their age. I also see that a lot, which we talked about.
It happens so much in Dynasty leagues.
Yep, see it all the time where Crosby is all of a sudden worth nothing just because he's 33 or whatever the hell he is. And you don't want to do that. And the last thing, which I talked about a lot with trading, is don't be afraid to use players that you know you're not going to keep as leverage to either get a player you really want or to upgrade for the next season in the terms of picks. Even though I know I said picks aren't that valuable, you can still put yourself in a better position for next year while not downgrading that position in the current moment by too much. And I think that about wraps it up.
Yep. So I'll give a little bit of a recap about the stuff we talked about at the beginning. Patreon and Discord, which we already mentioned, are both linked at fantasyhockeypodcast.com in the header. Please join us on our Discord. It's growing quickly. We only really kind of soft launched it like a week ago, up to 50 people. A lot of people really knowledgeable. I'm really excited to see this community grow. We've had a lot of good questions just internally about deep keeper leagues and dynasty leagues and really complicated stuff, which is fun to hear as opposed to just somebody asking me if, Malkin is a good player every once in a while.
Answer is no, he is not.
Or the 700th line A question. But so those two, you can find them at our site. You can also go to patreon.com/fantasyhockeypodcast. Again, with that, we will not be paywalling any content or tools or anything. It's mostly a little bit behind the scenes stuff and beta access to things and the live, and of course the listener league. So, which we'll have more details about later. We assume that we're going to make it a benchless league, which will be interesting. And I don't think a lot of people have played that, but don't quote me on it yet.
I'm quoting you on it.
Yeah.
Of course.
The idea that I have for it it'll be a weekly free agent acquisition budget, benchless league, bangers league. So the idea here is that we don't really know how a listener league is going to function as far as activity. We expect people will drop off the Patreon or maybe just stop paying attention to it or whatever. And with the idea of a benchless league, those inactive teams will continue to be competitive. And that's the most annoying thing that everybody knows is when teams stop setting their lines in the middle of a week or something, and then some other team gets a bunch of points they shouldn't have gotten. That sucks. Yep. So we'll see we want to take it this way to start with. I don't want to ramble too long, just to deal with inactive teams, and we'll see how it plays.
Yep. And I'll let you think about that. I'm going to go have a stroke because it's like 1,000 degrees here. And I need to close my window. Of course you are. Of course you are. I'm only allowed to be comfortable when I beat you in fantasy. And other than that, we will be back. Again, remember the schedule is on our Twitter, so make sure to go check that out. And you can see when the next episodes are coming out. Maybe one is more relevant to you than the other. And other than that, thank you for listening. And we will see you on, I think, next Monday. Probably next Monday.
Sometime, I don't know.
So one of those days.
Yeah, I think it is next Monday is the next one, yeah.
The schedule reminder is really just for me. Anyways, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.